Cyprus, the counterintelligence podcast, hosted by IXN Solutions, the company you turn to for corporate counterintelligence expertise and creators of 351X.
And we're live. Joe Sheridan, good afternoon, my friend. How are you doing?
I am doing great, Jeremy. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. I've been reading the news here, and here we are about halfway through January. By the time we publish this, we're probably going to be closer to the end of January, beginning of February. But Joe, a lot of counterintelligence in the news. As you saw, Alder James passed away at 84, probably one of the most damaging spies within the CIA. Great win. And then I'm recently reading, just a couple weeks ago, the FBI has reported a 40% rise in counterintelligence arrests, with 85 individuals detained. Joe, what happened in 2025?
I think you told everybody it was the year of counterintelligence, and they just decided to make you right. Because I was also reading that Director Patel said that there had been more evidence supporting counterespionage investigations sent to Congress than at any other time in history. So obviously, we continue to have a problem, and the focus on kind of defense and depth is as important as ever. And there's still some folks doing bad things.
And I'm confident that our agencies out there, the Department of War, the IC at large, the Bureau, is going to catch those guys doing bad things. And congratulations on a good win. A little bit of my soul dies when I say 85 people are detained conducting espionage. Boy, that's a lot of people. And I got two questions, Joe, I want to bounce off you. Number one, what happened the years prior? Did we miss these individuals? And number two, boy, I hope we have a proactive approach to prevent this, so the adversaries, when they're thinking they have a real spy, they don't. Because, boy, it's a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that there has absolutely been a reinforced focus within the FBI for a lot of different reasons in the last year, and I think that showed in some of the success. But, I think bad people are always doing bad things. It really just comes down to how lucky and how focused we are on finding them. It's just kind of crazy to me that there is still that kind of number of cases that are running through the system at any given time, and we know that there's more. And then to your kind of second point, the term that I see now more than ever is 85 disruptions through investigations, and disruptions means that they stopped something from continuing to happen, but usually the damage was done. And so, to your point, I would much rather find out that there was no news about espionage because a spy never was able to start executing those kinds of activities. Obviously, that doesn't win the headlines, but we do know that it keeps the country where we want it to be and keeps companies able to make money and do the things they want to do.
Yeah, to echo what Nick Epiphysitis said during our podcast a couple episodes, we cannot arrest our way out of this problem set. And I think that is true. We need this whole of government approach to stop bad people from doing bad things. And there's 5 functions of counterintelligence. I'm very hopeful the CI community at large is leveraging those other 4s. But this clearly illustrates the trend and highlights the need for continued investment in counterintelligence. And I'm hopeful 2026 is going to be the year that really presses forward with reshaping how counterintelligence is done from a whole of government approach.
Yep. And when you say whole of government, it's because there are a lot of enablers that make counterintelligence, proactive operations, and those other functions really work. And that kind of brings us to the guest that we have here today, who has been one of those enablers, at least during my career, for well over a decade. Colonel Dave Acosta, I first met, I think, as a major when he was on the Pentagon staff with the G357. And, working at the Pentagon is not usually something that anyone looks forward to. But I remember Dave showing up at our office back in the day routinely, a lot more than any of his colleagues. And he was always excited to figure out how we were going to get after the bad man. And, it was just a pleasure working with him back then. And he's continued to go on and do great things. I think he actually transitioned to the reserves at some point shortly after, I think, IPCS. And since then, I know he's had battalion command. He's currently, I think, juggling a brigade command. He's a student working on his PhD. He is also a professor. And I think he has time in there to be a dad and a husband as well. So, Dave, thank you so very much for taking the time out of your very busy life to talk with us for the next hour, and welcome to CI Press.
Well, thank you, Joe and Jeremy. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and see you guys again. And yeah, it's been a decade, I think, since I'd seen you. We had all talked. Joe, I think I missed you at the War College by a couple months. You graduated maybe 21, and I started in 21. Was it Heather Gregg, one of my mentors, was there, and I think she recalled, working with you, and it kind of highlighted what the things we were doing a decade ago, a little bit more than a decade ago, and it was a lot of fun. We certainly made it fun, and I am not a counterintelligence guy. I'm an information operations guy by training, but I had learned early in my career how important you guys are to a lot of what we do, both from a defensive but also an offensive side. And being able to work with you guys, and I worked with you and your counterintelligence community, both deployed, but then stateside, was fantastic. It was a fantastic opportunity, and one that I encourage others to do as well. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, Dave, you started to mention it, and I should have gone into a little bit more depth. You've really got especially these days, an incredible kind of pedigree of experience. Everything from psychological operations, deception. You've got a background in electronic warfare, operational security, and that those kinds of topics have very much come into vogue in both the media as well as within the intelligence world, as we are seeing some of the new technologies really making those things more prolific than ever. So if you don't mind, we like to start these things by kind of having you start telling us your story, how you got into the Army, and how you got onto the path that led you to us today.
Sure, absolutely. Well, so my story, my path, it wouldn't be complete unless I talk about my dad, because my dad had a huge impact on why I was here. And he was he enlisted in the Army in 1967, and was for a few reasons, kind of listening to Mike Maroney's podcast a few weeks ago, very similar. Like, he just had a lot of good luck. He was sent to language school to learn Vietnamese, and someone pulled him and 5 other people out of the class and said, "You're going to learn Russian." And because someone had this great idea that, hey, 6 people in one class learning Russian might be a lot easier and quicker than, say, 37 people in a class of Vietnamese. And so, fast forward, he finds himself in Germany and not in Vietnam, as a SIG-enter, listening to Russian communications on the border. Decided that being an NCO wasn't quite what he thought it was. So he went back, finished his degree, got his commission, and as an intel officer, and then got sent right back to Germany as a platoon leader. I'm born in the mid-'70s over in Germany. We come back. Well, on his 3rd tour, we're stationed in Garmisch, Germany, at the Russian Institute. Now the Marshall Center. And so we lived there from 1981 to 83. And I remember this. And part of his travel, and I know, and I'm sure now, knowing what I know now, I'm sure they were heavily briefed by the counterintelligence community about what they were doing. But we would travel to Eastern Europe. We would go, we spent Christmas, New Year's 1981 in Budapest, Hungary. And one of my memories, my dad, we're driving across from Austria to Hungary. And back then, there was no man's land. You cleared the Austrian border, there was nothing, and then you hit the Hungarian border, and there's border guards, and it's everything we've seen in the movies, AK-47s, And so we're sitting there in our American wagon, and I'm in the back seat, and my sister's in the way back with the luggage. She's only 3, and my dad sees 2 or 3 border guards around the back of the car looking in, and he's real cool. He's like, "Everybody cool, what are they looking at back there?" I'm like, "I don't know." And my sister starts giggling. And, and she's making faces at the guards, and my dad sees this, and they're making faces back. And he immediately gets out of the car, and he's got a pack of Marlboro Reds that he is like, "Hey, you guys want a cigarette?" Hey, yeah. And he speaks fluent in Russian, and he starts talking to these guys, and it completely changes the whole mood of the scene. And these guys, "Oh yeah, well, hey, yeah, we won't say no to American tobacco." And it was just that kind of thing. The next year we went to Berlin and went to East Berlin with him and one of his classmates from the MI advanced course, who was stationed there with the U.S. mission in Potsdam. And we're running around East Berlin talking to Russians and Soviets and everybody, and it was something to remember. And then a couple of years later, ironically enough, that gentleman we were with Art Nicholson was killed over there inspecting a Soviet tank. It was just, but I remember, things that stand out. So my dad was a Soviet foreign area officer, but he also spoke Spanish. And so not once, but twice in the 80s, he deployed to Central America as a military advisor. And so in 1991, while the rest of the Army was gearing up to go to Desert Storm, he was in El Salvador as the G2 advisor to the Salvadoran Army. And I went to visit him, I was 15, a lot of kids our age, go to summer camps. I was in El Salvador kind of learning about counterinsurgency. Which was fascinating. Years later, I would find out from one of my dad's peers or one of his guys there, just the kind of work he was doing, and it was human. He was a humanter, and he was gathering information. And they were like, "Your dad was so cool," and I was like, "Oh yeah, I think he's a pretty cool guy." No. We were in some real bad situations, and your dad was always cool. He always knew what to do. And I was like, "Oh, he never told me those stories." Okay. So. It was really fascinating to watch him there. And then fast forward 18 months, right before I graduated high school, he was the first defense attaché to Kazakhstan for about 6 months, and went over there and helped stand up, the defense attaché office. And he brought a bunch of Kazakh officers back. And, this is in the early 90s. It's the Cold War is over. Hey, we're going to be, we got to be open here. And so I went to visit him and these Kazakh officers in the Hotel Washington. We were living in Annapolis at the time. I think I ditched school. I was And so I go in and he's sitting there, and it's like 12 o'clock, and he's got 3 or 4 pizzas and a case of Miller Lite, and he's talking to these guys, and they're all drinking. He's telling them about the Army retirement system, and this is what you guys should aim for. And he's like, and he told me later, he's like, look, they know I'm an intelligence officer. They know what I'm an attaché. That's my job. He's like, but in order to build trust and friendships, this is, we got to talk to them and communicate. And he maintained relationships with those guys for years after he left. Fast forward in college, then he's doing ballistic missile defense exercises with the Russians in Colorado Springs. And he introduces me to the Russians, and I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I find myself one night playing horse with these 4 Russians at the basketball court, and it's, we're drinking and we're making shots, and oh my God, it was hilarious. But after that, they thought my dad was a righteous dude, because they're, clearly if I can get drunk with these guys, he's acceptable. And so, kind of watching my dad through that, and he retired out of DIA as a civilian in 2011. And it really kind of shaped my attitudes towards the intelligence community, towards what I was trying to do. So from there, going in with those experiences, and the fact that I'd seen the movie Top Gun in 1986, I thought I was going to be a fighter pilot. And at the time in the early 90s, there weren't a whole lot of pilot slots in the Navy, but there were in the Air Force. And so I went out and visited the Air Force Academy, and it was, it's Colorado Springs. It's awesome. You go to West Point in February, and it's gray and it's dark and it's cold. You go to Colorado Springs in May, and I had all 4 seasons in one day. And I was like, this is a pretty cool place. So I went to the Air Force Academy, tried flying, realized I didn't like it, and quickly said, if I'm going to stick it out here, as nice as it is, if you don't know how to pilot in the Air Force, you're kind of a second-class citizen. So I decided I was going to go into the Army, and I started that path. Really, my junior year, we had an Army exchange officer who took us, few misguided souls, and would take us out to do weekend maneuvers once a month. Hey, these are what troop leading procedures are. This is what an op order is. This is how you do land nav. So we didn't look like idiots when we got to OBC. Coincidentally, at the same time, one of the things that kind of put me down the path that I would eventually go on is in my sophomore year, we had a leadership lecture series, and there was a speaker from what was called the Foreign Military Studies Office, which still exists at Fort Leavenworth, a guy by the name of Tim Thomas. And he came and gave this speech about Russian information warfare. And this is the fall of 1995. And very clearly, I remember him talking, the Russians have said that if they're ever the victim of a cyber attack, they will, by a state, nation state, they will not rule out the use of nuclear weapons in response. I was like, whoa, this is some serious stuff. And so, kind of with that in mind, fast forward, I was right about to graduate from the academy, and this, the Army officer that had helped us, I was in his office talking about something, and he was like, yeah, I've been picked up for this new career field that's just starting. This is 1998. And he's like, it's really powerful. We're going to use information as a weapon system, and we're going to do cyber stuff and electronic warfare and And in my mind, I was like, well, this is really lame. Like, I'm going artillery. I'm going to blow stuff up. What would you do with information? His name was Boyd Brown, and we'll come back to Boyd in a little bit. So went to Fort Sill, and then eventually went to Germany, where I was a fire support officer for an mech infantry company. We deployed to Kosovo, and I find myself in a no fire area, kind of working with NGOs and international organizations, kind of leading, hey, this is, working together. And then I remember, some of these meetings we would go to, there'd be an Army guy in nondescript clothes kind of sitting in the back, and come to find out, well, that's your humantor that's, they're kind of working things, or, kind of gaining atmospherics. I'm like, oh, all right. Usually it was a warrant officer. And it was kind of my first introduction to, yeah, exactly. It was my first introduction to, kind of like the bigger MI picture. So it was, okay, kind of noted and stuff. And, it was worthwhile for me. Well, come to find out, I'm kind of engaged in local leaders, having coffee on the street, that sort of thing. Well, I run into Boyd one day while I'm there in Kosovo at Camp Bonsteel. I was like, he's like, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm engaging local leaders. I'm kind of, using the targeting process to figure out how to, shape the environment and stuff. He said, you're doing information operations. And I was like, oh, crap. Yeah, I am. It's exactly what I'm doing. So I had an interest in that. Fast forward a couple of years later, and I find myself in Bosnia this time as an individual augmentee to the headquarters stabilization force in 2002, 2003. And they literally, I was a young captain. I had been less than a year as a captain, and they were literally like, do you know how to spell IO? And I'm like, yeah, of course. And they're like, well, you're hired. You're going to be the IO planner. And so I found myself, I made the mistake of demonstrating I was competent early on. And the next thing I know, I'm working interagency operations to target war criminals, their financial structures, financiers. And so I'm working with the State Department, the Treasury Department, the intelligence community, the organization called the Office of the High Representative, which was a UN mandated organization led by a Brit at the time, Patty Ashdown. And this is like, this is not something they teach in OBC or the War College or, any you insert it. And we're kind of making it up on the fly. And I'm developing sort of our strategic narrative and how we're going to do all this. And I was hooked. I mean, it was amazing work. And to have I was working with the intel community, and they were, really kind of, it was fascinating. And so I was hooked at that point. Fast forward a couple of years, I went to the captain's career course at SIL, then I went to Korea, where I just did artillery stuff, shooting rockets. And I got by chance. It was 2005. I did not have a combat patch. I was ready to go to Iraq. I lost a lot of friends there already. And I called the assignment manager for the IO community, and he's like, hey, the war in Iraq's not going anywhere. I got to fill this slot at Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. When can you get there? I'm like, all right, December. And so I went to NPS, and by far it was probably one of the best educational experiences I've ever had. I mean, I was just a vacuum sucking all this stuff up. And while I was there, I had to write a thesis. And so initially it was going to be about strategic communication and how we, do things writ large. But I went to the Pentagon, and nobody could tell me who was in charge of it. So thankfully, Israel and Hezbollah went at it in the summer of 2006. And so I started looking at the IO picture. And that would eventually morph into a paper about how Hezbollah would use deception in the 2006 war. And it was really, eye-opening to me because, one of the things that they did that exposed me to it was, they used double agents. They were passing, disinformation to Israeli intelligence officials about the locations of bunkers, so that, in the opening hours of the attack, the Israelis were targeting these fake bunkers. Meanwhile, Hezbollah was sitting in the real ones, targeting them, when they came up, and so it was really powerful. And so I started looking more at sort of this idea of hey, what are these double agents all about, and how do we utilize them? And there's a good book, Cassidy's Run, by Bill Wise, which is great case study in sort of a couple other and then we kind of read about the sort of the great double agents from World War II. Operation Garbo, Eddie Chapman, the Brits in their double cross system, was amazing. And so fast forward, I go back to Germany, deploy to Iraq, and part of my thesis got published in a journal, and they, my commander was like, "Yes, sir, let's do it." And so, enough to be dangerous. And so I was gathering my team, and we kind of a team of the witting, and I went into the G2X, and I said, "Hey, look," I went to the G2X actual, and he was a grumpy gentleman that didn't really want to have anything to do with us, which was fine. But our JIDIC LNO, she was like, "Yeah, let's work together." And the KICA, the counterintelligence coordinating agent activity, there was like, "Yeah, sure." Authority, there we go, was all about it. And so, we had this team, and we would plan different things. And at one point I went to the KICA and I said, "Hey, look, I don't need to know the ins and outs." I said, "But we're going to do this operation, and I've got this. If it could get into the hands of people, I think it could make a difference on, in terms of what happens in this operation." And he's like, "Yeah, man, I got it. Sure, let's do it." And so he took it. And then about 3 weeks later, we actually saw impacts in the operational environment. Some things moved around, and the only reason they would think that was because of what we were shaping, what the picture was looking like. And not only was he it was a win for him, but it was a win for us. And we took it to our commanding general, and he's like, "My G2X did this? Really? My guys? This is awesome." And I'm like, "Yes, sir, your team, yeah." And so we were, again, it was really powerful. So, I took all of that, and, I had it in the back of my mind. Did another tour in Iraq after that from 9 to 10, did a little bit more, with the counterintelligence, mostly in our division, and part of it too, on the defensive side, it was looking for sort of those gaps and seams where we could be vulnerable, and we could potentially, leverage that. Oh, hey, they're going through the trash. Oh, might be a good idea to put something in the trash then. Or they're doing this, or, this is going on. Okay. So it was, really, it was fun. I mean, I think, and you guys were there too. I mean, I felt like we could try a lot of things and see what stuck. You do it safely most of the time. But yeah, I was hooked at, this was a very powerful tool, counterintelligence as a whole. And I was just scratching the surface of it. So, like Joe said, after that, I went to ILE for 4 months and met this guy, Dave Pounder, was there at ILE with me in the short course, and then went to the Pentagon and started working with you guys at FCA, and that was really, you talk about an organization back and forth between us where we had mutual trust, we had this constant communication. And I think it started kind of at the top too, with when Teresa was in charge there. She was very, I mean, we went out and we talked to people together. We, worked together, and it certainly helped a lot. And at one point she was fighting for me to come down to be the XO. I think, Joe, when you were the 3, and it didn't work out, but still, I mean, it was a lot of fun. We allowed for, we did creativity. It was never, and it was like, "Oh, hey, let's go focus over here in Europe one time." And then it was like, "Oh, hey, let's go focus over here in the Pacific." And just, just constant communication, which I think was beneficial to us all. The only downside to it all was that professionally, it didn't. My OERs weren't that great, and as a result, in 2014, I got passed over for lieutenant colonel, which was a huge personal setback to me. You know what I mean, but you know that's what's it's what happens, and my functional area took a big hit. I think it had a 35% selection rate that year. And you know, people were like, well, you should just get out, you know, you can take the temporary early retirement. And I was like, no, I still got a lot to offer. I got a lot of experiences, and there's people that need this. And so I looked at the reserves, made some decisions for family reasons too. And said, I went into the Army USR system, and I found 4 IO battalions in the reserves, and I picked the worst one. And I said, I want to go there and make a difference. And so I did. Came into the reserves in about May of 2015. And within a year, I'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel. And then a little short, about 3 months after that, they asked me to take the battalion, be a battalion commander, which was not something I had ever thought I would do. And so, and then all of a sudden, I really did have an opportunity to kind of change things and do things that, teach people, teach, coach, and mentor folks. And we got a new MTO for our organization that actually has deception teams on it, 3 deception teams. And so working with one of my sergeants majors who happened to be a contractor down in Tampa, we said, hey, it would be good to get one of these teams in support of CENTCOM. And so we went down there, we wrote we helped them write the request for forces for one of our teams. And we worked it through. At the same time, I had this is about, 8 years ago now. I had one of my officers was at the 35 Echo course, learning becoming a counterintelligence officer. I think it's gone now. It's kind of all source, but at the time, and I called her up and I said, hey, what do you want to do with this? And she's like, well, sir, I got to be honest. I'm looking to transfer and I want to do something else, because I'm just want to get the CI, mark on me. I said, I got it. I said, I will give you an opportunity to do something so cool that nobody else in the Army is doing it. I said, you will spearhead an effort. You will develop these deception teams and you will write your own path after that. She was like, I'll give you a chance, sir. What do you got? And so, I enabled her to build the training plan, train these, and she just ran with it. And she's continuing to do great things today, which was, that's what you live for as an Army officer. So I did that. I actually ended up commanding that battalion for 4 years, which is not something that happens. But 2 people turned command down and they didn't have backfills. And my bosses were like, hey, just stay with it. And so, I left command in 2020, kind of did a year on staff and then went to resident war college there at Carlisle, which again was really cool. I had a great experience, Joe. I don't know if that was your experience there too, but a lot of fun. And then coming out of there as a reservist, we were given the opportunity to do a utilization tour. And so living in Norfolk at the time, I ended up on the Joint Staff J7, Joint Warfighting Development, looking at sort of what is a future force design. And we had, we developed what was called the Joint Warfighting Concept. We tested it out in experimentation and wargaming, and then it went into doctrine. And then we shared it with our allies and partners. And so it was really I was a deputy director, I was essentially the chief of staff doing all this, observing it. And it was fascinating. It was really interesting to see because this was 2022 into 2023. We've all been around the military and nothing moves fast. It's kind of things can take years, but the joint warfighting concept that was approved in 2023 basically went from a signed copy by the chairman into doctrine within 6 months, which for the joint staff is like, we're talking lightning here. So that was really fascinating. And so, and then in 2024, I was picked up for brigade command of we call it observer controller trainer brigade based out of Denver. And I've been doing that. For the last 18 months. So Meanwhile, on the civilian side, in the summer of 24, I applied for and was selected as a intermittent professor of practice at the Naval Postgraduate School, teaching technical operations in the information environment. And so, working with my boss, Dr. Chris Paul, we've been, he's you can look him up on all things information operations. I do research. We do research. We're working on a paper on the use of the employment of drones, or excuse me, decoys, and how things like drones can impact their fidelity. So that's been interesting, and then developing war games on things like on the cognitive warfare topic. We'll talk a little bit more about. And then because I'm a glutton for punishment, I started my PhD about 2.5 years ago at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. In international studies and kind of looking at doing research on, hey, what is the sort of disinformation landscape? How are things developing? What does it look like? Hey, how does this impact things like our island partners, or Pacific Island nations? And so starting some research on that and kind of getting after it. I got a few more years before I get 2 more years before I finish classes and start to work on the writing. But that's more or less in a nutshell, kind of my story and how I got here. And it's been great. I really had a tremendous time doing all this, and just very fortunate. And luck has a lot to do with it. So.
What a unique story, Dave. Thank you for sharing. I want to echo something, right? When IOs teamed with CI, you're a significant force multiplier. And you've mentioned that through several different vignettes. Going back and looking at your Air Force days and Top Gun being an influence to go to the academy. Now that Top Gun 2 is out, Maverick, did you make the right decision?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I like the second one. I mean, it was, but I don't ever look back on that. And I think a lot of it too has to do with leadership. I'll tell people, you're not always a commander, but you're always a leader, and being able to lead soldiers is, I think it's a tremendous opportunity. So yeah, right call.
Well, I know we were glad you made the call, because we were able to benefit from it greatly in our careers. But, for kind of our listeners, I'm going to ask you to kind of take a step back a little bit, because we talk about IO, or information operations, and we talk about deception, and it sometimes gets used interchangeably. So if you don't mind, kind of take us through what information operations is and isn't. And then, obviously stay at the unclassified level. Also talk a little bit about the deception piece there.
Sure. So, and information operations has gone through a number of iterations. You'll see senior leaders that want to kill it and they'll call it something else, but then it doesn't really go away. But essentially, it's the integration, coordination, and synchronization of you can call them information capabilities, information tools, both to achieve an advantage, but also to protect your own forces. And so, achieve an advantage over your adversary while protecting your own forces. So if you keep that in mind, and there's, as IO has developed over the last, let's really call it the last 50 years, since the first sort of paper on then information warfare was written in the 70s, kind of saying, hey, information warfare, we need to protect. In order to get warheads on foreheads, we need to protect sort of the information space. That was basically what it was. We need to either attack the adversary sort of networks, or we need to, protect our own. That was, it was written in a paper by Boeing for the Pentagon, like in 1975, and and I think the Air Force and the Navy kind of adopted that, and you see that come to fruition during Desert Storm, what they kind of call the first information war. A lot of electronic warfare, the beginning of cyber operations, and all that. As a result, you kind of see this shift to what was called command and control warfare, and it was electronic warfare, military deception, operation security, kind of mixed in. And then in the mid 90s, you went through information warfare and information operations. And initially, there were 5 core capabilities of information operations: electronic warfare, cyber operations, operations security, psychological operations, and then deception. Yeah. And then it's gone back and forth. But think of it really as a toolbox for leveraging information as a weapon system to achieve commanders' objectives. That's the biggest thing. And it's not any one particular, it should be the synchronization of multiple ones. So whereas deception is about deception is about taking actions or inactions, influencing a particular decision maker to take actions or inactions which will be beneficial to friendly objectives. So, while obviously IO is kind of the bigger set, the subset is, hey, can I get leader X to do this? Can I get Saddam to commit to an amphibious invasion? Well, I'm going to go around and do the left hook. So that's the classic. I mean, and more recently in the second, in OIF, the fact that and General Franks talks about this in his book. There was an agent that was passing disinformation, passing fake material about our intentions to Saddam, and because we so tightly controlled the information environment around the Iraq, he was convinced that we were going to land forces out in the west, or we were going to go in through the north, and that wasn't in the cards. So that's kind of the thing. And that's, if you had to differentiate deception versus IO, those are the two things. Is that influence in that particular decision maker, whereas psychological operations is influencing sort of a vast population to do to achieve a certain effect, or to take a certain behavioral approach or change, as it were. Does that make sense?
It sure does. Thank you. So, kind of building on that, if psychological operations is kind of more of a mass kind of impact tool, would you say that, the lingo of the day, misinformation and disinformation, really is kind of more synonymous with psychological operations? Or would you say that it falls in the vein of one of those other vehicles we're talking about?
The U.S. will tell you that U.S. psychological operations only works with the truth. You have attributable and non-attributable psyop, where attributable being that we would say it's us, versus non-attributable is delayed. We may not necessarily admit up front that we're the ones doing it. You could use the term psychological operations to adversary. From an adversary perspective, they put out disinformation, that is, knowingly put out false information or misinformation, information that certain people may believe to be true, but isn't. It's but it's kind of morphing as the years go by. Things get rebranded, and so kind of this idea of cognitive warfare comes in, is this idea that now. Whereas, the PSYOP guys used to broadcast stuff on radio stations, or they would have a television station, you do a leaflet drop. Well, now they can, pick up their phone, with a phone, you can tailor an algorithm on TikTok to just see things in their feed that puts you in an echo chamber. So you're only seeing one particular thing. So that's, and I think that's why in talk about, amongst people about, cognitive warfare, a lot of people are like, well, you're really either talking about psychological operations or political warfare, which was a term that was in vogue for years and years, particularly during the Cold War. So it's yes, it depends. Is it like it's METTC, to quote Army speak.
Yeah, that term cognitive warfare, pre-2010 roughly, I don't remember hearing it. It was always PSYOPs, information operations, military deception, and then 2010 comes around, and all of a sudden the news buzzword is cognitive warfare. Dave, what happened that it changed the community to start using that lexicon, and really what is it?
So I think, I'll give you a textbook definition here, but I think we started to, if I had to pinpoint one thing, and I'm not saying this caused it, but Twitter, the rise of Twitter, and I'll give you a good example of this. So 2010, there we are, we were in Baghdad, and we had this incredible information strategy. We messaged, we were getting it out. Soldiers were handing out handbills about what we were doing. We were on the news. We were constantly messaging. We had an Arabic Facebook page. We put stuff out every day. Very much. I would say, probably out of all the places I've been, that was the best, like, sort of we controlled the information environment. Things would happen, people would accuse us of stuff, but we were kind of Teflon Dons. Things didn't stick to us because, our message was just repetitious delivery of messages. Within 6 months of us going back, the Arab Spring had kicked off. And if you recall, Twitter was like the epicenter of mass mobilizations, of people, bringing people together, and that kind of, the ability to reach out and touch someone specifically, or have them, see something on their phone, or, get them to go out and demonstrate, was huge. And then you started to see the rise of influencers that were not real, that were, someone claiming to be, someone they were not. And these false personas would, kind of started to change the game. And influencing people on this sort of cognitive level. Fast forward then 4 years, and you're seeing, you're starting to see the rise of the Internet Research Agency in Russia. Mass groups of, essentially bots putting out vast volumes of information. It was a significant emotional event for the U.S. Army back in the day to put something out, to put out something on Facebook in Arabic. It was like, people thought you were going to break the internet if you did that. And, but the volume that we were having to deal with. And then, you take it a step further, and you have sort of the, I think, when Russia marched into Crimea, and you kind of see the beginnings of the Ukraine war, that also plays a role. I wrote a paper for school talking about how, truth subversion, impacting the international liberal order has been kind of the shoot down of the Malaysian Air Flight 17 in July of 14, I think it was, or was, really sparked, maybe it's 13, but it really kind of sparked a change, and all the disinformation that flowed from that, from the Russians, kind of, and the impact it was having on people, kind of really, that's where you start to see the wheels turning in terms of this idea of cognitive warfare, that populations are being attacked, that, leaders are being, targeted. And so NATO, particularly NATO, which was interesting, starts to see this, and then they do research, and then up, in the 2020 to 2022 timeframe, they start putting pen to paper and really defining this idea of cognitive warfare. And they have this cognitive warfare concept. I'm gonna read the definition of it for everybody. They identify it as the fight for cognitive superiority. Contesting in this environment comprises deliberate, synchronized military and non-military activities throughout the continuum, designed to gain, maintain, and protect cognitive advantage. There's a fancy way for saying, you can think what you want, but, we want to kind of protect what those thoughts may be. So it's, there's obviously offensive elements, but there's also defensive elements. And the threat's real, particularly when you look at, European countries that are dealing with sort of this deluge of disinformation. This idea that, hey, we may be, Austria's a good example. Even though they're not part of NATO, they see the challenges here because, if they ever have to mass mobilize, they want to be able to reach out to the population and bring the reservists in. But if they're all convinced that the fight isn't worth fighting, they may not show up to the mobilization site. Or how do you recruit amongst the population if they have been, taught to believe that the military isn't a noble cause, or isn't, their country isn't worth fighting for. And those are extremes, but they're sort of the reality of the situation we work in. Likewise, I've always told people, can you imagine, on the first day of a ship deployment, soldier or sailors start getting texts on their phone or emails saying that their commanding officer, looks at child porn, and the damage that would do instantaneously to crew morale, cohesion. I mean, and it doesn't need to be real, but it's the reality of what we're dealing with on a even on a very limited scale, and I think that's just the beginning. So, yeah.
Well, I think it's kind of fascinating to see how technology has enabled things like Twitter to have such an impact. And I remember when Musk was getting ready to buy Twitter, I think there was an FBI guy, I'm quoting from a Rogan episode, I'm pretty sure, but like FBI guy cited that 80% of the users on Twitters were bots. I mean, so it just goes to show how much our adversaries think of that vehicle as a way to exploit things like misinformation, disinformation. My question for you is, how does the algorithm that all of these systems are using either enhance or make information operations more difficult, or cognitive warfare? Because in my head, I'm thinking that the algorithm is creating that echo chamber. So if you can get within it, then it probably helps a lot. But if whatever disinformation you're trying to project does not jive with that algorithm, is it that much harder to get it to seep into society?
No, I think, Joe, that's a good question. It's sort of the war of the algorithms. How do you obviously those algorithms are set up to kind of put people in those echo chambers, but I think to an extent we've kind of experienced this in the past. It may be not, the echo chamber isn't as strong as or it's more strong now. But again, getting into it and kind of, once you figure out ways, or, it may not be completely changing the behavior, but it may be just, shifting it a little bit, shifting, what a population group thinks or, believes. And it's hard. It's not an easy thing. So, kind of, we've always said it's, the far, one far side or the other far side, probably you're not going to get a whole lot of impact, but the folks in the middle are probably the easiest to, or at least the most willing to listen to different opinions, or to, try to get the silent majority to take the action which you're hoping for. And that, I think, it's, you look at various messages the Russians have put out over the years, or even the Chinese. And it's interesting to see how, a lot of this stuff is very subtle. It's not, rants that would just drive us nuts. It's, the Russians portray themselves as far left, far right, center. And they really do their homework in terms of these bots and what these people, look like and see. And, it's well versed on that. And so, a lot of times it's just about the polarization. It's not about getting them to change the echo chamber. It's about, ramping up the voice, as it were. So, and then of course that does make it a challenge. But it's not just, and it's not, we were talking about sort of the Twitterverse, but it's not just there. I mean, it also, we see it in video games. I mean, video games are being, modified to kind of exploit this. People are playing video games all over the country, and if you can get in there in these groups and what you're doing, you can exploit that to shape perceptions. And of course, we've all talked about the rise of deepfakes. I could pull articles about, during the Maduro raid, after the Maduro raid, how many deepfake pictures emerged of him doing one thing or another, and none of it was real. And so it's, and I'll kind of, say it now, but I mean, these are all challenges I think, the CI community needs to, you got to be on top of now in order to be relevant for the future. How do you identify these risks? How do you identify subversive efforts against U.S. military personnel that are going on in video games? I mean, do we hit, I don't know, Joe, I mean, Joe, did you sit around all day playing video games trying to find this stuff out, as you were, in past assignments? I'm going to be doubtful. I saw you work. You did a lot of work. So, how do we get after that sort of thing, those sorts of threats, and identify them? It's hard. It's really a challenge. And then kind of, what is the future of an agent Garbo, a double agent passing disinformation. What else does that have to? What else do you have to do to accompany that? Do you have, it's not just the material itself. It's like, hey, do we need to produce deep fakes of this guy walking on a beach somewhere to highlight it? The story, I think there's more to the story now that needs to be thought out. So yeah, AI is not going anywhere. We're it's either kind of adapt or become irrelevant.
Yeah, Dave, I was just looking up. Twitter started in 2006, and 2 years later, Russia invades Georgia in 2008. And they used a very active information operation campaign to quickly move through Odessa, Abkhazia, and really capture the former Soviet Republic, getting back under their territory. And then I look, nearly 5-6 years later, 2014, they invade Crimea. They adapted. They learned what they did in Georgia. They adapted. The little green men are running everywhere. They caused distrust, discontent among the very civilian population that are trying to take over, and they win that. They continue to evolve and adapt, and in 2022, we saw the invasion on Ukraine. I think they have a very active information cognitive warfare campaign that I'm hopeful that our community takes a look at. But looking at how technology advances, the access is at speed and scale for us to employ cognitive warfare. Our technologies are advancing at rapid pace right now. How do you think, and what do we need to start taking into consideration to kind of outmaneuver or better posture ourselves with the speed of technology in cognitive warfare?
Well, I think it's two part. I mean, one, you've got to be kind of self-motivated to keep pace with the technology and understand it. Story on my reserve side. So there's a new data platform called Vantage that we've been told to use. And I told my staff the other day, I was like, look, it's not going away. It's not perfect, but we need to start briefing off of it now. Let's get familiar with it. Let's figure out all the ins and outs, and we'll be better cyber citizens in the future. What I think, though, the other part of it is a human element, and where I think, from what I've seen, everything you guys done in the counterintelligence community is you guys really have that down, and you kind of have that. AI can only go so far if you're not, and I think Sean talked about this in an episode. It's machine human teaming that if they're not, the human brain picks up on things that AI may not. And being able to recognize that. Plus, you go and do a meet with somebody, you're helping somebody out, or you're talking to you get a much better vibe than anything that'll be picked up in in a large language model. So, I think it's being able to, and success in a lot of way will be, how do you master both elements of human and sort of the AI or, technology, side of things. Because I do think you can learn obviously from this sort of younger generation, and but at the same time, there will always be that that CW4 and CW5 that have been doing it for 40 years that can clearly tell you this just doesn't look right. There's something about that that's iffy. So yeah.
Dave, let me build on that, because you're a guy that's been around that world your entire career. But as the capabilities get better, it is easier and easier to not know which of those pictures of Maduro are real or just absolutely, completely counterfeit and made up. So to the uninitiated, I mean, what do you tell your kids when they're online and they're spouting off facts that are not real, or quoting somebody's that said X is a fact and it's not? How do you protect the general public from being victims to this emerging technology?
Yeah, well, with my kids, I've got young ones, so I'm trying to, they're like, no, Siren Head is real, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's no such thing as Siren Head. No, really. Look at that video. And I'm like, I know. I'm just here to tell you. Just take it from me. You take it from me. Godzilla's real, but not Siren Head. Just keep that. But I think, I don't know. Mine seem pretty digitally savvy in some aspects, and they do go, yeah, that's not real. That's clearly, if we go, but then again, sometimes it's things that I'm like, oh yeah, we did that. Like we turned off the lights in the bathroom and we, said Bloody Mary, and and I was like, we didn't even have this, we just heard that from other kids. So the fact that they see it on YouTube now, I'm like, oh yeah, all right, give it a shot and see how it goes. But it is about education. If you look at sort of Scandinavian countries, they have really good education systems. Starting in kindergarten to educate like on what is fake and what is real news, or what are the facts, sort of discern the facts and understand what the facts say. And you may need to go to 2 or 3 different sources. I was talking to a colleague about using ChatGPT to find the facts. And we take a far right news article and take a far left news article and put them into ChatGPT and have it generate like a middle of the road article, and that's probably going to be more or less what the truth should be, or what the facts are. So it's you got to hear it from multiple sides, but we're so busy, that's a challenge. We don't have time. It's a constantly moving, world, and then there's not enough time, and you only get sound bites of things. And so, how do you get how do you open your mind up for something like that when all you have time for is the 15-second sound bite? It's a challenge.
Yeah, no doubt. I want to echo a couple different things that you said, because we're coming up on time, Dave. But, as a community, the battlefield has changed. We need to really look at all means to disrupt what the adversary is doing. That cognitive warfare is the space we needed to be into yesterday. And for our community out there, if you're not there, we need to be there. Get there, leverage all means, because, again, we cannot arrest our way out of the current problem set. There are more spies running around right now than there has been in the history, or at least we're catching more. I don't necessarily believe that there are more. We're just probably better at finding them. But now we need to shift to those other functions of counterintelligence to protect. And that big protect piece is, leveraging IO, cognitive warfare, as teamed with CI to make a significant impact. Dave, looking back at your entire career, because you gave a great story and truly appreciate it. What recommendations and words of wisdom do you have to our audience?
Well, I can't say enough things about mentorship. Finding mentors. It's a never-ending process. You got to find people that you can talk to, you can share ideas, and sometimes admit your concerns or your fears, and be willing to listen to the feedback that you get. And it's not just people that are higher in rank; it can be people that are lower in rank, and kind of sort of the 360 approach. I like to borrow a word from Mike Maroney. Find the rabbis that are out there. I think that it's like, you want to find those guys and gals that know their stuff, that you can go and say, hey, what should I do? And they usually have these pearls of wisdom that we can use. I felt, working together with you all, I was mentored a lot. What I really liked about your community was that you're very, engaging. We could always talk, and I'd be like, well, could we do this? And you're like, no, that doesn't work because of this and this. And you need to think about this aspect of it. And I'm like, well, this is how I'm thinking about it. And what, oh, okay. And we would have great dialogues. It was really, it was really kind of touching to me. A couple of years ago, one of the folks that I'd worked with, in 14 reached out to me, and they were like, hey, we're thinking about doing some stuff over here in Europe. And can I pick your brain? I was like, sure. It was honored. It was like huge. And so, again, I was grateful, it doesn't stop, you gotta be open and available to people. And so I'm grateful for you guys and Mike, Mike Dye, and funny enough, Mike Dye lives down the street from my dad. And so I drive by his house all the time, see the big truck out there. I gotta stop in and, I gotta harass him some more. And Sean doesn't live in the area anymore, but yeah, I can't wait to see him again. So yeah, it's just great. It's just great to help people and continue the conversations and have those beers where you're laughing about, like, you remember that time when we did the thing with the place? Yeah. So Lastly, I've got some book recommendations I want to throw out there. I think that are important to readers, and they're really kind of three categories. There's leadership. I recommend 3 books on leadership. Like it's kind of my trilogy. If you know who Ori Brofman was, he wrote The Starfish and the Spider, kind of about the power leaders networks. He also wrote a book called The Chaos Imperative, which is a sort of very interesting look at leadership dynamics. He wrote it kind of talking about the Army in the late, like 2009 to 2011 period, after he met with General Dempsey, who at the time was in charge of TRADOC. It's a good book. Then the two of them wrote a book together called Radical Inclusion, talking about leadership in the 21st century. And General Dempsey talks a lot about sort of this narrative space and having the battle of the narratives and which one wins out versus, and facts becoming increasingly irrelevant in some regards. A great book, the two of them. And then Dempsey wrote his own book called No Time for Spectators, about his time kind of throughout his career, but culminating as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I think for a lot of us that were impact. I mean, General Dempsey, I think, had a lasting impact on the U.S. Army. And the Joint Force, because I mean, in a lot of ways, we were all kind of together, whether it was, in Iraq or, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or even his impact on TRADOC. I mean, he was the man behind Mission Command. And so, those buzzwords are clearly his. When it comes to future war, 2 books I recommend. The first is called Origins of Victory by Andrew Krepanevich, who was a retired Army colonel who had been part of Office of Net Assessment. And he's talking about like innovation and how great armies innovate and what makes them successful in the future battlefield. And then the last book with that is White Sun War by General Mick Ryan. It's a futuristic war on the island of Taiwan. If you ever read Red Storm Rising, Team Yankee, that kind of genre, that's exactly what it is. And so, I mean, it was a quick read. I was like, this is really, I was like, I'm a Red Storm Rising guy. I'm all about that. When it comes to sort of IO and tradecraft, I want to talk about really 3 books. First, I mentioned earlier David Wise's book, Cassidy's Run, which is a fantastic book about, sort of running a double agent. Thaddeus Holt's book, The Deceivers, is like an all-encompassing 1,400-page book about all World War II deception. It's about 800 pages of story, and then about 600 pages of appendices, like of every double agent, who they were, operation names. It's fascinating. And then you just can't go wrong with Ben McIntyre and his books, Operation Mincemeat, which was the whole floating the dead body off the coast of Spain, which is really powerful. And then he has other ones, Double Cross, the true story of the D-Day spies, how they passed disinformation to the Germans and the impact that had. So that's my short reading list on these topics. So,
Dave, I think that's a great list. A lot of classics in there, and I've got a few new ones. It looks like I need to read myself from that list. So thank you for that. And you said it, mentorship is key. So I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm sure there's some folks that have a lot of questions, because an hour is just not enough to really get into depth on some of the things that we've talked about. What's the best way for folks to get a hold of you if they do have those questions?
Yeah, LinkedIn. You can reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm responsive there. I mean, I think that's how, through Sean and linked up with Jeremy. And I think it's David Acosta on LinkedIn. I think there's a picture of me. Actually, I think I was in Taipei doing a war game. So it was cool. It was a cool experience. So, yeah. And I mean, I'll respond, just connect and send me a note, and I'll link up with you.
Hey, Dave, thanks again for taking the time. What a great story. And again, for the audience out there, if you have any questions, Dave's responsive. I know firsthand with LinkedIn.
Well, thank you both, guys. I really appreciate this opportunity.
No, it's great to get people in like you that really. I'll try to say it in a way that makes sense. Counterintelligence is always accused of having a very difficult time providing tangible results. And, one of the beauties of partnering with enablers like you and some of the organizations that you work with is, you were able to show national level results because of some of the things that you made happen for us. And it was just an absolute pleasure to work alongside you. And I love the imagination, and I loved kind of the zeal that you brought to want to make sure that we left our mark. So thank you so very much for speaking with us today. And I have no doubt that there's going to be some people hitting you up to continue the conversation. And I'll tell you, kind of continuing the conversation is something that we've tried to help enable in other ways as well. So for folks that have any questions about counterintelligence, you can always go to ixnsolutions.com, which is where you can talk to the team and set up conversations there. But we also have a dispatch site on Patreon, which is really meant to kind of put out information about some of the capabilities, like exactly the ones Dave talked about, as well as the latest that's going on in counterintelligence. And if that's just not enough for you, then you can bounce over from there to our Dispatch Central Discord site, where the community writ large of intelligence professionals are able to have conversations much like the one we just had. All right, Jeremy, I need to take a breath. Your turn.
Nice work, Joe. What a great conversation. Dave, thanks again. To our audience out there, if you have a topic you want the IXN team to cover, go ahead and send it our way. We're always looking for fresh new ideas and guests. And that's the other piece. If you want to be a guest, send that over. We'll most certainly make that happen. We'll end with, if you recognize a problem, recognize it first, react to it accordingly, and then most certainly report it. Thanks for giving us a listen, and until next time.